Despite their challenges, the refugees worked their new lands with an optimism which impressed other settlers in the colony. By the end of 1816, Preston had 924 black settlers and Hammonds Plains had 504. Other black refugee settlements developed at Windsor Road, Refugee Hill, Beach Hill, Porter's Lake, and Fletcher's Lake. While Survey General Charles Morris reports the refugees' lack of clothing in an almost naked state, they still show amazing numbers when taking a statistical account of the lands cleared at Preston in 1816. Under those same conditions, close to 87% had already cleared a decent portion of their land. On meager rations, lack of tools, lack of shoes and clothing to protect from the weather conditions. The champion numbers are at Section C, where 91% made an improvement to their lands, and in Section D, 96% of the black refugees erected houses. Simultaneously in Section D, 100% made improvements to their land. One would wonder, how is this possible for the black refugees, whom were surviving on absolutely nothing? We would have to look at the misunderstanding of slavery. Most regard northern slaves as a higher quality set of hands, usually regarded as artisans with better knowledge of domestic chores and more often work in closer quarters with their masters. In contrast, on a Georgia Sea Island plantation, there were many field hands engaged in labor, while at the same time, others were employed as nurses, cooks, carpenters, gardeners, coopers, and house servants. More skilled slaves operated machinery in the rice production process. More importantly, the most overlooked job on a southern plantation is the black driver. Black drivers had control over the plantation life. In Georgia, they dogged out food, punishment, pace of labor, slave conduct, almost every aspect of the manufacturing process. This would leave slaves in autonomy from their masters for long stretches of time. There were also plantation managers who employed task labor, in other words, filled the quota, therefore reducing the need for white supervision. Another production method was gang labor. For the Virginians, clearing land and cutting firewood was familiar. Long work days were regular. To plant, harvest, and seed was nothing new. Being accustomed to autonomy, self-regulated on large fields with long, strenuous work days, can explain why the black refugees did not abandon or evacuate their lands like the previous black settlers or soldiers. As they were to become farmers on a land that was segregated, it was not necessary for them to have a prior background of extensive communication or living inside a white household, when in this new situation they were not to become their next-door neighbor. The stereotypes of the field and house slaves have been around for centuries. In this situation, the so-called field hand refused migration to Sierra Leone and refused the government's plans to return them back to their masters in the United States. President Madison and Secretary of State Monroe had reason to believe that the British were reselling the runaway slaves back into slavery. Monroe also believed that the black refugees were incapable of liberty and longing for the protection of their old masters in the U.S. In order to investigate the claims and retrieve the black refugees in Nova Scotia, Monroe sent a special agent, Augustine Neal, to Halifax in August of 1815. Augustine Neal came to find that the claims were untrue, and only one old woman, Harriet Johnson, agreed to return to her home near Baltimore. Neal tried to persuade the refugees to return to Virginia, playing up to the winter's frost and climate. Nonetheless, all the black refugees, with the exception of Harriet, refused to return to the United States. Out of 2 attempts to remove black refugees to Trinidad, only a mere 95 agreed to depart in a single vessel in January of 1821. They made these decisions as a group on their own, and their independent decision was made amongst the persuasion and horrible conditions set by the local government. Some of the refugees wrote letters to their former masters. A Jeremiah West, who appears on the Halifax list, wrote to his former master, "Thank God I can enjoy all the comforts under the flag of old England, and here I shall remain till it please God to call me out of this world." He continues, "I am doing well at my trade. I am well furnished with tools, and the gentleman gives me great encouragement in my trade. If in any case you should ever come to Halifax, I shall see you. If not, we will not see each other till we meet either in heaven or hell. In another letter to a former master, a black refugee thriving as a blacksmith at Preston, Bartlett Shanklin writes, "I have a shop and a set of tools of my own, and I am doing very well. When I was with you, you treated me very ill, and for that reason I take the liberty of informing you that I am doing well as you, if not better. When I was with you, I worked very hard, and you neither gave me money nor any satisfaction. Since I've been here, I've been able to make gold and silver as well as you." These accomplishments refute the stereotypes that the black refugees could not maintain in a free society. You do not expect to hear of a black refugee building and owning houses and thriving as a blacksmith or a truckman. Even till this day, it's not common to hear of a black refugee obtaining material success, or a black refugee writing a letter to a former master who could not read or write himself. Most histories, especially those written before the 1980s, describe the black refugees as destined for poverty and misery in Nova Scotia. Robin Winks, the author of Blacks in Canada, showed a disfavor towards the black refugees inside his book. On page 124, he writes, "What had gone wrong with the refugee settlement in Nova Scotia?" He continues, "Virtually none were trained to any particular skills. Unlike the slaves that accompanied the Loyalists, most had been field hands who lacked the indoor slaves' incidental knowledge of domestic chores and who had not learned how to live side by side with white men." He continues, "Originally from the South, they suffered more than the Northern Loyalist Negroes from their Southern injection into a new climate." He describes the black refugees as having greater ignorance than the previous. To make his point, he quotes another, "Their troubles were real, but they preferred to let them lie on other men's doorsteps." He also writes, "Even in their own community, they did not learn how to work together for themselves. On the contrary, the black refugees often fed each other and even housed each other. Winks failed to recognize it was them who chose their neighbors and settlement patterns. These patterns created the inflections and customs inside the community, making it easier to help one another. Those who had been neighbors in the United States usually sought to become neighbors again in Nova Scotia. Former Georgian Sea Island slaves tended to settle more at Hammonds Plains, while former Chesapeake slaves prevailed at Preston. Nonetheless, each settlement had a smaller amount from the opposite area of origin. Many came on the same ships and went to different settlements. John Cooper and John Hamilton's ex-slaves settled at Hammonds Plains. Robert Hamilton, Richard Hamilton, Kitness Hamilton, Jacob Hamilton, they settled on lots 1 through 12. Also, the majority of Pierce Butler's slaves settled at Hammonds Plains. The black refugees of a Mr. Wiley from the Georgia Sea Islands also settled mainly at Hammonds Plains. At Preston, Levin and George Winder, former slaves of a Mr. Winder from Virginia, settled at Preston together. Walter Diggs and Gabriel Hall were from the Maryland region, which is also classified as the Chesapeake, and they also settled at Preston. The migrations to Nova Scotia are far from a monolith. To understand the difference and complexity of the migrations, we can turn to a sociolinguistic study, a research project where the accents of the Black Loyalists and Black refugees were studied. The reason for the study was to find a missing link to the original African American vernacular English and inflections used during the days of slavery. So, why was Nova Scotia chosen for the study? Although Ontario was the well-publicized terminus to the Underground Railroad, many of those fugitives returned back to the United States after emancipation. This left Ontario's free slave settlements scattered and sparsely populated. The language of the residents of those areas had largely assimilated to the larger popular white vernacular. In the late 18th century, Nova Scotia is said to have contained the largest free black settlements anywhere in the world outside Africa. And although many of the first immigrants made their way back to Africa, the black refugees replaced those numbers and more during and after the War of 1812. As a result, Nova Scotia continued to contain the largest population of former American slaves outside the United States. In the early to mid-1850s, nearly 2,000 blacks resided in the city of Boston, Massachusetts, about 1,500 in Providence, Rhode Island. During the same time span, over 2,000 black refugees lived in the Halifax, Dartmouth region alone. Nova Scotia was also chosen because of the direct old line population. Old Line refers to the original migrants from the United States and their descendants, as opposed to the more recent immigrants from the Caribbean and Africa, who were not the focus of this study. The linguistic science experts were Sarah Polak, who is the founder of the Ottawa Linguistics Library, and Sally Tagliamonte, whom have both held the Canada Research Chair. They found that there was a retention of the African American vernacular English without any prior Creole or Caribbean influence. Due to the long years of segregation in Nova Scotia, they found a missing link that the American slave recordings themselves couldn't provide. They found that after the abolition of slavery, the older slaves in the U.S. would have had more external influence. Especially in the elders recorded, they found that African Nova Scotian English is very close to the original inflection spoke of the southern slaves in the Virginia and Georgia areas. Let's compare the two.
You might as well not tell them because you ain't getting no science for it. You might as well not tell them nothing about it, or just leave it in the hands of the Lord.
I had a brother, though. He could tend the children. And, just sit him down in a corner and put this child, you know how little children put this child between his legs and then hook his hand around this child. That's where he nursed it.
Oh, I lived my life. I am, and then we all lived our life.
That's why you celebrate that day. Colored folks celebrate that day.
Now let's turn to a comparison between males.
You could go to somebody's house, and we didn't have no house like they got now. We had these what they call log cabin, and they have maybe one old colored man would be there. Maybe he'd be as old as I am. He'd be the preacher, and they'd all sit down and listen to him talk about the Lord. And sometimes we say, I wonder if we'll ever be free.
Remember when we went down the field, down in the king, way back down in the lake, hunting for treasure? This is my third pill. I had the alligator. This is my third pill. I know my family. I know who love me and who don't. Remember that well over there? That well right there. That well. And we went to the field. Okay, that well.
That's what's good about being Scotian. Ain't nothing like young people. Right? Even if it don't work out, don't make difference, we're all still gonna be friends, we're all still gonna be family. And that's how it works. Right? But that's why our parents bring us up. Right? It didn't work out, let it go on by, we're still gonna hang, we're still gonna marry. That's part of life.
They made a comparison to the African Nova Scotian English of the Black Loyalists of Guysborough and the Black Refugees of North Preston.
When I was small, somebody gave her something, we had it, or else she took the flour bag. Used to buy the flour bag in white bags with the Robin Hood on it, and she boiled it on the stove till she got the Robin Hood out of it. She would make us a pair of pants.
Yeah.
And a jacket, shirt, summertime. And then they used to buy a little box of blue, and she'd put them back on the stove, and she would boil the dye into them, so we'd turn them blue. Instead of white, And that's what we had. And I mean, we had a pair running down the road in it, and on Sunday, she called it the good ones to go to church with.
I think the bear got off me. I was going down, there's a little camp down on the railroad, right a little way from the railroad. I seen the little house down there. I went down the old track. I went down there, and they had two doors on it, but the door wasn't fastening them. And I looking like that, and I looked in that door, and I looked back in the corner, I seen a great big eye. I run back, and that thing getting there, and open catching me.
You run for your life.
I had to get away, and he run for his life, but he didn't catch me. And that thing stayed out there, and he pulling the railroad track off.
Both communities have been segregated. Their studies show Guysborough having less characteristics of the African American vernacular English than the Black refugees in Preston, although still showing a form of early Black English from the United States. These differences can be attributed to the date of migration, origins, geographic background, religion, attitude, conditions, and overall goals of the entire groups. Overall, this study highlights the fact that the Black Loyalists and the Black refugees are far from a monolith. The genetic sound material samples And the studies that follow show that the black refugees have a distinct culture of their own. In this last example, we'll contrast the black refugee descendant Ruth Johnson of Africville, Nova Scotia, with the next slave recording some 50 years earlier.
Don't let us be pushed over by the racists. Now that we older folks are leaving you, I'm every note. And my days are short. I'm only on board time. Maybe I'm on some of you fellas' years. But stand up for what's right. And what you know is yours. Cling to it. Because once it's lost, you can never gain back something what is lost. God bless you all. And make this a unanimous decision that that park will remain, and let Mr. Wallace take that road out to the south end of the city and put it there.
I always had something to do every day. I didn't have time to play very much at all. I myself was in the house for most of the time. In days like this, while we were outdoors pulling up weeds, make them through the yard, or every day. And in cloudy days, while we were in the house, we had a big pan of sand, silver sand in an old slipper, scrubbing up the floor in the big dining room where they ate the meal.